The sound was less like a roar of war and more like a dying breath. The Maybach engine of the Tiger II tank coughed, sputtered, and died, the heavy silence that followed swallowing the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the turret, SS-Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the steel hatch, a dull, metallic clang that was an echo of frustration and mounting panic. This was the opening move of Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble. And their most powerful tank had become a 68-ton Coffin. The gauge on Third. Piper's voice was low, tight. From the driver's compartment, the answer came back, tight with barely controlled fear. Empty, Herr Obersturmbannführer. The reserve tank is also dry. Around him, the spearhead was dissolving into a motionless, blacked-out column. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 elite Waffen-SS soldiers, the entirety of Kampfgruppe Peiper, was paralyzed. This was not the work of enemy artillery or a clever minefield. It was the crushing, quiet failure of logistics. The war's most feared armored column had been stopped dead by a fuel gauge needle pointing at zero. The question wasn't how they would defeat the enemy, but how they would even move. That impossible, urgent problem created an instant, visceral bond with the viewer. How could this happen? The answer lay ahead, veiled in the morning mist, in a small, abandoned American depot. The paralysis of Peiper's column was not a logistical hiccup. It was a symptom of a terminal strategic weakness woven into the very fabric of the entire operation. Peiper's orders were audacious. His Kampfgruppe was the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes Offensive, tasked with punching through the American lines and seizing the bridges over the Meuse River. The sheer distance, over 65 miles of expected heavy combat, was the first red flag. His initial fuel allocation, a meager 31,000 gallons, was enough for barely 50 miles of operations. The math simply did not add up. The difference between survival and catastrophic failure was to be bridged not by German ingenuity, but by American negligence. General Sepp Dietrich, Peiper's army commander, offered a staggering order. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. This single sentence ripped the mask off the entire strategy. Hitler's final offensive was less a military plan and more a gigantic gamble, a hope that the Americans would be so stunned, so unprepared, that they would abandon enough of their supplies to fuel the Wehrmacht's last great charge. Why, the viewer has to ask, would a modern army launch a do-or-die operation with a built-in dependency on the enemy's supplies? The answer, as Peiper was about to discover, revealed not just the scarcity of German resources, but the incomprehensible abundance of the enemy he was fighting. The discovery of American fuel ahead was about to deliver a brutal and unforgettable lesson in the new calculus of industrial warfare. Peiper climbed down from his immobilized King Tiger, his gaze cutting through the winter gloom toward the abandoned American position at Hansfeld. The silence was unnatural. The U.S. 99th Infantry Division had evacuated in such haste the depot was a ghost town, preserved in the moment of its desertion. Fires still burned in abandoned oil drums, casting a faint, warm glow on metal cups where coffee was still hot. It was a picture of incredible carelessness, or confidence. And then, the sight. It stood there, lined up with military precision, rows upon rows of thousands of distinctive olive-drab American jerry cans. Peiper's adjutant Hans Gruller pried open one and sniffed the vapor with a reverence usually reserved for a prayer. "Benzin, Herr Obersturmbannführer," he reported, his voice cracking with emotion. "High-octane gasoline." The air instantly filled with the desperate, feverish energy of men who had just seen a miracle. The column, moments ago paralyzed by despair, sprang to life. Soldiers began the frantic work of siphoning and pouring, their arms moving like pistons. They were drinking in the elixir of movement, of life, of a chance to continue the fight. This was their moment of false climax, the euphoric high that comes from snatching victory from the jaws of immediate, certain defeat. They had solved the impossible problem with a single massive stroke of luck. But this staggering bounty, this gift of war, was about to teach Peiper a brutal lesson in the new calculus of industrial warfare. Peiper's immediate relief turned to something colder as his staff took inventory. The count finalized at 50,000 gallons. The sheer magnitude was, as one officer later recalled, staggering. In a single abandoned depot, a mere Class 3B fuel station for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division, they had found more fuel than what was allocated to most German panzer divisions for an entire month, and in some cases, more than a corps had received in the last 6 months of fighting. This wasn't just a logistical find. It was an artifact of an entirely different economic war. The Americans could afford to leave this fortune behind because it was completely disposable to them. Peiper realized this depot wasn't a vital lifeline. It was a mere overflow tank in an ocean of American supply. The irony deepened with the contents of the jerry cans. It was high-octane aviation fuel, rated 80 octane or higher. While the German 74-octane Maybach engines could run on it, the hotter, richer fuel was highly inefficient and even caused mechanical strain on the finely tuned Tiger IIs. The fuel was literally too good for German engines. It was a subtle yet damning detail. Germany was fighting a war of desperate scarcity, while their enemy was so rich in resources that they were essentially running their tanks on premium, high-performance racing fuel. The captured supply was a gift that simultaneously provided life and served as an immediate, crushing prophecy of their inevitable defeat. The mathematics of abundance had just revealed the true, hopeless scale of their enemy. As the American high-octane gasoline sloshed into the thirsty German tanks, a silence fell over SS-Obersturmbannführer that was far heavier than the silence of the stalled engines. He watched his men, hands stained with the precious, life-giving fluid, but he felt no triumph. In fact, a crushing realization settled over him like a cold, paralyzing fog, the true, unforgiving scale of his enemy. This was the pivotal thematic climax of the entire operation. Peiper's thought process was ruthless and immediate. If the Americans could afford to abandon 50,000 gallons of high-grade fuel, if they could leave behind what Germany would have to defend with an entire division, then this war was already over. The war was not being decided by the courage of his grenadiers or the thickness of his Tiger's armor. It was being decided by the ability to treat 50,000 gallons of fuel as trash. Peiper realized Germany had not merely miscalculated the strength of the Allied lines, it had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. They were fighting a nation whose industrial wealth transformed the very currency of warfare. The desperate success of finding this fuel became the ultimate prophecy of their inevitable defeat, the terrifying aha moment that shifted the war from a tactical battle to a logistical impossibility. The crushing realization that the war was logistically unwinnable was then brutally affirmed by the paper trail of doom the Americans had left behind. In one abandoned hut, Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, one of the few men in the Kampfgruppe who could read English, uncovered a stack of shipping manifests. Peiper demanded to see them. The documents coldly detailed the fuel's journey, crated in Texas, shipped across the Atlantic, offloaded in Normandy, and trucked into Belgium. A 6,000-mile journey completed in less than 6 weeks. Peiper read the dates and the origins, the sheer, unimaginable velocity of American logistics, and went pale. He crumpled the paper, realizing the fuel wasn't a miraculous windfall, it was merely one drop in a tidal wave. The final confirmation came from a crumpled copy of the military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, dated December 15th. The front-page headline celebrated a massive new achievement. The Allied pipeline network, particularly the line from Cherbourg to Verdun, was now capable of delivering 300,000 gallons of refined fuel every single day.
The math instantly created a psychological chasm.
A single, unseen, static American pipe could deliver more fuel daily than Peiper's entire attacking force, the Schwerpunkt of the offensive, would use in its desperate maximum effort push to the Meuse. The paper trail, meant to track supplies, instead became a track record of the Third Reich's inevitable failure. This tangible evidence delivered the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle, hardening Peiper's suspicion into certainty. The Americans weren't just fighting a war, they were running an unstoppable global industrial machine. The desperation Peiper felt watching his Tiger stutter to a stop was not born in the Ardennes. It had been fermenting for 6 months. This sudden, agonizing scarcity was the inevitable result of the Allied oil war. Since May 1944, American and British bombers had systematically targeted the German synthetic fuel infrastructure, the very lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. The results were catastrophic. Germany's synthetic fuel production had been choked by 90%. The massive Luna works, which supplied a third of the Reich's motorized fuel, had plummeted from producing 175,000 tons in April to a mere 5,000 tons by September. This wasn't a shortage, it was collapse. The once mighty Luftwaffe was grounding planes for lack of aviation fuel, forcing pilot training to be drastically cut from 250 to just 60 hours. On the home front, gasoline was so precious that any black market theft of even a few individual liters became a matter for the Gestapo. Germany, once a pioneering military power, was reduced to fighting a modern mechanized war with logistical desperation. This established the German side as the starved giant, driven by courage and tactical skill, but hopelessly crippled by the lack of the single most crucial commodity of the 20th century. To understand Peiper's horror at the 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, one must grasp the overwhelming scale of his enemy. While Germany, the starved giant, struggled to produce its meager synthetic supplies, the United States was quite literally drowning in oil. In 1944, the final desperate year of the war, the United States produced an unimaginable 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Compared to this ocean of supply, Germany's entire output, including all captured fields and synthetic production, was a mere puddle at 33 million barrels. This meant the Third Reich was trying to fight a highly mechanized war with less than 2% of the fuel production capacity of its primary foe. America was, in fact, responsible for producing over 67% of the world's oil during the war years. The difference was so vast that a single U.S. oil field, the legendary East Texas field, produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. This staggering 50-to-1 ratio delivers the shock value. Peiper was not just fighting an army. He was fighting an industrial machine so gargantuan it operated on a completely different plane of reality. Germany was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with a logistics train that, by comparison, was still powered by horse-drawn logistics. A futile effort against an American ocean that could not be drained. This contrast between German need and American casual abundance is the core value proposition of the story. The shock of the 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld was amplified when Peiper realized that America's oil ocean was linked to an insurmountable industrial machine designed to deliver that abundance with relentless speed. This was the true nature of the enemy, a logistical force, not just a fighting force. Crucially, the Allies had already built the systems to guarantee this supply. Beneath the English Channel, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was pumping 1 million gallons of fuel daily from Britain directly to France. This was an unseen, constant river of fuel. Coordinating this flow on the surface was the legendary Red Ball Express, a massive 6,000-truck convoy system that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The scale was so vast that the Red Ball Express operation itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B, the entire Western Command, received in a month. By December 1944, the American supply lines were not merely meeting demand, they were creating a surplus. Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily, but their systems were delivering 8.2 million gallons. They were systematically accumulating massive reserves while actively fighting. This showcased the enemy as an insurmountable industrial force. Peiper was fighting a machine that not only produced 50 times more oil, but had engineered a system that could not be stopped and could not run dry. Fueled by the miraculous, stolen lifeblood of 50,000 gallons, Peiper's column roared back to life, surging forward in the renewed hope of a breakthrough.
They continued to hunt for supply dumps, successfully capturing additional, smaller stores along their path. This sustained movement reinforced the immediate sense of tactical victory. The German method was working. However, the continued advance also yielded crucial, horrifying intelligence: American operational maps. These documents, intended to aid the invasion, revealed a truth far more disturbing than the initial supply shortage. They detailed the entire Allied logistics network. The maps were covered in markings for fuel stockpiles, not just single isolated depots, but a sprawling, ubiquitous network. Peiper learned that his 50,000-gallon windfall was an insignificant fraction of the whole. The U.S. First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. This intelligence was a poison pill. Peiper's 50,000 gallons, once a source of euphoria and salvation, was revealed to be meaningless, a mere rounding error in the face of such abundance. The captured maps, meant to chart a path to victory, became the ultimate proof of the strategic impossibility of the German position. This intense foreboding set the stage for the column's push towards Stavelou, where the enemy's logistical might would be demonstrated not by a simple stockpile, but by an act of spectacular, deliberate destruction. The momentum bought with the stolen 50,000 gallons brought the column to the outskirts of Stavelou. Peiper knew the stakes. This depot was rumored to contain an enormous haul. As his spearhead approached, he wasn't seeking a mere 50,000 gallons, but a final, decisive fuel supply that would guarantee their operational life. What he found instead was the answer to Peiper's crushing realization: a high-impact, visual confirmation of the enemy's strategic superiority. Inside the depot, the American military had already moved. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received a stark, unequivocal order: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The depot contained an estimated 2.1 million gallons of fuel, a fortune that could have irrevocably shifted the battle into the Germans' favor. As Peiper's lead elements came within sight, the Americans executed the order. Engineers poured gasoline trails across the ground and tossed white phosphorus grenades into the massive storage tanks. The explosion was not a boom, but a deafening, rolling whoosh. A column of black smoke shot up, quickly followed by a staggering, hungry wall of fire, 100 feet high. The Inferno was immediate and tremendous, burning with a ferocious intensity. The Americans had set fire to a liquid fortune. This singular, high-impact act of destruction confirmed the central thesis. The enemy possessed such abundance that they could deliberately and spectacularly destroy a vast quantity of material simply to deny it to the German forces. Dedication was defeated by gasoline, and the sight of the 2.1 million gallons burning was the new, terrifying logistical reality. The German advance guard brought the news back to Peiper, and he went forward to witness the scene. Instead of the promise of 2.1 million gallons, he saw a black pillar of smoke rising over 1,000 feet into the sky, a massive, roaring column that was visible for miles. The sheer noise of the Inferno was the sound of certain defeat. That fuel that could have powered the entire column to the Meuse would burn for the next 3 days, a deliberate, spectacular display of American wealth. Peiper watched the flames devour the massive fortune, an act so wasteful it was incomprehensible to the German war machine. He turned to his driver, Unterscharführer Solinger, and spoke the words that captured the ultimate emotional release and tragedy of the moment. They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?
That question was the emotional culmination of the entire script, expressing the final, devastating hopelessness of the German effort. This act of tactical demolition was replicated across the Ardennes. In total, the Americans destroyed over 8 million gallons of their own fuel, a quantity that exceeded Germany's entire allocation for the final offensive. Peiper's realization at Hansfeld, confirmed by the Inferno at Stavelot, was that they were not fighting an army, they were fighting an economy that could afford to use fuel as a weapon of scorched earth. The terrifying reality of American industrial power was most clearly understood through the contrast between German need and Allied waste. This difference had a profound psychological impact on the German troops, shattering their morale more effectively than any artillery barrage. The stark reality was eloquently summed up by a captured officer, Colonel Frederick von Donher, who articulated the moral shock of fighting an enemy of limitless wealth. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years," he reportedly stated.
You burn millions of gallons, we measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance? German prisoners were routinely more shocked by the casual abundance of American logistics than by their firepower. Seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations, throw away perfectly good cigarettes, or, most tellingly, use precious gasoline simply to start a heating fire in a barrel made the war feel entirely hopeless. While German command prosecuted the black market theft of individual liters of fuel, the Americans were incinerating millions. This wasn't merely a supply gap, it was a profound economic and psychological disparity. The sight of this systemic, almost careless American wealth turned the abstract numbers into a tangible, morally shocking reality, confirming to every German soldier that their dedication and tactical skill were irrelevant against an enemy who possessed the means to simply waste its way to victory. The hope bought at Hounsfeld quickly succumbed to the logistical reality confirmed at Stavelot. By December 19th, the column's forward momentum had evaporated. Tigers and Panthers were being abandoned in increasing numbers, not due to shell damage, but because they had simply run dry. The final, fatal blow arrived on December 20th in a brief, chilling radio message. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft, no resupply possible. Peiper now knew his remaining fuel, scrounged from ditches and damaged vehicles, was only enough for a short, desperate fight or an immediate, hasty retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, the same logistical machine that starved Peiper was demonstrating its unlimited capability elsewhere. Even as Kampfgruppe Peiper ground to a halt, American C-47 transport planes were flying 160,000 gallons of fuel to the surrounded, besieged garrison at Bastogne. This single, stunning comparison encapsulates the entire problem. The Americans were flying more fuel to a desperate cut-off unit than Peiper's entire elite spearhead possessed. This undeniable truth ensured the inevitable collapse of the German offensive, proving that the enemy had not merely defeated their thrust, but had transcended the entire concept of scarcity. The failure of the offensive culminated in an agonizing, tragic finality. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, with no possibility of resupply, Peiper made the ultimate, symbolic decision. He abandoned his entire command and led the remaining 800 men out on foot. Of his impressive starting strength of 119 tanks and assault guns, 39 vehicles remained largely operational, but completely immobilized, not by American anti-tank fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Before leaving, the order was given to destroy all remaining equipment. Oberrichter Heinz Gals later described the grim task of draining the last few drops of fuel, perhaps 200 gallons in total, from the entire Kampfgruppe Peiper. Peiper himself personally set demolition charges on his magnificent King Tiger command tank. Millions of Reichmarks worth of equipment, representing the very pinnacle of German military engineering, were deliberately destroyed by their own crews. Peiper's force had advanced 60 miles in the Ardennes, but their reward was a crushing final finality. They had discovered the strategic impossibility of fighting the Allies. The destruction of their tanks due to logistical failure, not combat defeat, served as a powerful, devastating visual. The most feared tactical weapon on the battlefield was utterly worthless without a steady supply of oil. The war had been decided not in the turret, but in the refinery. The Battle of the Bulge confirmed what Peiper had realized at Hounsfeld. The war was already decided. The ultimate authoritative conclusion was delivered not by the generals, but by the logisticians. Field Marshal Walter Model's chief of staff recorded the commander's devastating reaction to the 8 million gallons of fuel the Americans had destroyed. He said simply, "We are not fighting the same war." This sentiment was echoed even at the Nuremberg trials years later. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified to the strategic collapse. By 1944, we couldn't move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved armies like chess pieces across the board. The German soldier was arguably better trained and more experienced, but it didn't matter. This is the ultimate thematic payoff of the narrative. The lesson of the Ardennes was brutally clear. Production overwhelms courage. Abundance defeats dedication.
Germany's best soldiers and most fearsome tanks were rendered impotent because the war between industrial powers would be won in the factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals on the battlefield. Peiper's 50,000 gallons was a tactical success that revealed a strategic impossibility. He discovered he was not fighting an army with finite limits, he was fighting infinity. The final image of the story is not a battlefield, but a museum at Gleize. There, parked precisely where its engine sputtered its last, sits Peiper's massive, imposing King Tiger tank. It is a formidable sculpture of steel, a physical monument to tactical excellence. Yet it is utterly defeated. The final damning detail is the fuel gauge, frozen in place, forever pointing to empty. The ultimate emotional resonance of the story is captured in a famous, quiet exchange between two veterans who met at the site. A German veteran, identified as Wortmann, gazed at the tank and recalled the crushing memory of Stavelot, his voice laced with bitter irony. He lamented, "We stopped because tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" The American veteran, Anderson, replied with the simplicity that contained the entire truth of the war. "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it." This final dialogue delivers the perfect emotional summary. Peiper's spectacular capture of 50,000 gallons was, by the American standards of 8.2 million gallons in daily consumption, a literal rounding error. The Red Ball Express burned more fuel than that in 3 hours.
The Tiger tank sits in the museum not as a symbol of military might, but as a chilling reminder of a strategic truth. It is a monument to when tactical excellence met logistical reality and lost. The most valuable resource was not courage, but oil.